I'm Carl Bruch, and I'm Director of International Programs at the Environmental Law Institute. I also serve as President of the Environmental Peacebuilding Association. This video, I'd like to present an evaluation that the Environmental Law Institute undertook of interventions supported by the Global Environment Facility, or GEF, in fragile and conflict-affected situations. For those who are not familiar with it, the GEF provides grant funding to assist developing countries in meeting the objectives of international environmental conventions. The GEF serves as a financial mechanism to 5 conventions, namely the Convention on Biological Diversity, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants, the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, and the Minamata Convention on Mercury. But it funds more broadly in 5 key areas, including climate change, land degradation, international waters, biodiversity, and chemicals and waste, as well as many impact areas such as the Amazon, illegal wildlife trade, and sustainable cities. The portfolio evaluation was conducted because there was a sense that conflict and fragility affected GEF programming, but it was unknown exactly how significant the effects were or what could be done. The GEF has funded thousands of interventions in areas experiencing armed conflict or fragility. The prevalence of conflict and fragility in GEF target countries suggests that conflict and fragility should be considered essential contextual factors affecting the GEF's ability to achieve large-scale sustainable impacts and initiate fundamental change. Despite its substantial investment in programming in fragile and conflict-affected situations and the multiple effects of those situations on GEF interventions, the GEF does not yet have a definition, policy, or procedures for designing and implementing projects in fragile and conflict-affected situations. Literature on conflict-sensitive programming emphasizes the importance of institutional instruments in providing normative direction and practical guidance. Without such institutional statements, efforts to be more conflict-sensitive will remain ad hoc and uneven and continue to expose the GEF to institutional risk that could otherwise be managed. Several evaluations by the GEF Independent Evaluation Office have provided evaluative evidence on how conflict and fragile situations affect the outcomes and sustainability of GEF support. But these were very specific evaluations. For example, on GEF support to land degradation, on mainstream biodiversity, and on least developed countries. These evaluations have emphasized that fragile and conflict-affected states should be given due consideration in project design. Even though fragility and conflict are a key factor influencing project delivery and performance, there had not, as of the assessment, been an independent evaluation of GEF interventions in such situations. This was the first such evaluation conducted by the GEF Independent Evaluation Office to look at this topic across the entire GEF portfolio. The evaluation sought to answer 3 questions. First, to what extent do GEF-supported projects take place in fragile or conflict-affected contexts? So how common is this? Second, does a fragile or conflict-affected context have an effect on the success of GEF-supported projects? And if so, how? So does it matter? And third, to what extent and how do GEF-supported projects take into account conflict or fragile contexts in their design and implementation? So what can be done? So those are the 3 questions that we focused on. Methodology worked at 3 levels. Part of it was that there were more than 4,000 GEF-supported projects at the time. We analyzed 3 levels. First, portfolio-wide, particularly for the prevalence of conflict and fragility in GEF projects, and to the extent that we could do some quantitative analysis, we were looking at the impacts in the terminal evaluation reports. So that's the portfolio-wide level. Second, we chose 7 particular contexts. These represented different geographies, that is to say, different continents, different scales of work, different types of environmental contexts, different types of conflict, different stages of conflict, before and after, during, sometimes a mixture. Sometimes there were areas were in peace and others were not. These 7 included Colombia, Balkans, Mali, the Albertine Rift, Lebanon, Afghanistan, and Cambodia. Then the third level, we looked at specific projects, and we chose 5 to 7 projects in each of the 7 geographies and really drilled down into those projects, how they were designed, how they were implemented, and to the extent that they were completed, what the lessons from the terminal evaluation reports or other sources, what yielded in terms of lessons on conflict-sensitive programming. The evaluation methods were mixed methods. We did a combination of document analysis, statistical analysis, remote sensing, and interviews. The main findings of the evaluation track the 3 key questions that we were investigating. First, the vast majority of GEF projects are in fragile and/or conflict-affected settings. 88% of GEF projects were in either alert or warning stages of fragility. And about 1/3 of GEF projects were in countries affected by major armed conflict. That is to say, countries that had seen 1,000 battle deaths. So these are serious extended conflicts. Second, a fragile or conflict-affected context has clear effects on the success of GEF-supported projects. Statistical analyses of projects in the GEF portfolio show impacts of fragile and conflict-affected situations on several dimensions of project performance and outcomes. Fragility has a statistically significant impact on all indicators related to the terminal evaluation reports. And although details vary for each region, the regional analysis of terminal evaluation report ratings reveals that major armed conflicts can have a statistically significant effect, or almost statistically significant effect, on projects in 5 ways: sustainability, monitoring and evaluation design, monitoring and evaluation implementation, overall, and the likelihood that a project will be dropped or canceled. Moreover, the country's fragility classification is associated with a statistically significant impact on the likelihood of projects being canceled or dropped. In short, the fragile or conflict-affected setting matters to the success of the project. And we're not talking about does it build peace, it's does this affect the environmental outcomes of the project? And the short answer is statistically significant, yes. Also found that there were 5 key pathways by which the fragile or conflict-affected setting affects GEF projects. These are physical insecurity, social conflict and mistrust, economic drivers, political fragility and weak governance, and coping strategies. And one of the interesting things is that while most of these effects are negative, for example, physical insecurity making it hard to hire staff or impeding access to the project site, sometimes we saw positive impacts. So where there are situations of social conflict and mistrust, that context provided a motivation for projects that were designed to increase cooperation among groups. Similarly, where conflict and fragility had an impact, a negative impact on livelihoods that could then lead to bushmeat or other environmental harms, a number of GEF projects focused on livelihoods and sustainable natural resource management as a way of engaging with and addressing the context of fragility. So it's important to see that both the negative impacts and the positive impacts of the conflict and fragility on GEF projects. And all of these can affect the relevance, effectiveness, efficiency, and sustainability of the project. The third key finding was that a number of GEF-supported projects have already started to take into account conflict or fragile contexts in their design and implementation. It's worth noting here that the GEF did not have any safeguards or standards, policies, guidance, or procedures to manage conflict and fragility related risks as such. However, half of the 18 GEF agencies had already developed policy strategies and toolkits on conflict sensitivity. And in the absence of official guidance from the GEF, implementing organizations and project staff have innovated to meet the needs of their operating environments. As we collected the examples from the different GEF projects and interviews, we found that there were 5 broad strategies that started with acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that there was a conflict. There were a number of projects, though, that in their project documents said there is a conflict, it's a risk, and just left it at that. So there was no effort to manage the risks. So that's why we put it here, because it's the first step. You really do need to understand the context. But if you're not going to manage the risks, that's not really conflict-sensitive program. The strategy, or the most basic strategy that we saw, was avoidance. Conflict is over in this area, so we're going to work over here. And that is one way of avoiding conflict and the risks associated with conflict. The difficulty is that often conflict is happening in biodiversity hotspots. So if the GEF wanted to have the greatest impact on global biodiversity, it would need to work in that region where the conflict is going on, and that would need to be a priority. So avoidance can be a way of avoiding the risks of conflict, but it doesn't necessarily work where the environmental values, the environmental benefits are in conflict-affected settings. The next, and I would say the broadest role, or a suite of approaches, is on mitigating the effects and the risks associated with conflict and fragility. Some of this is through training, some of it was through monitoring and early warning to allow projects to adjust course. Many projects adopted participatory approaches, engaged local partners. There were dispute resolution mechanisms and adaptive management. That was the most common category of conflict-sensitive approaches. The next category, engaging proactively with peace building, we saw in a number of instances GEF projects making themselves more relevant and building in political will by engaging with peace processes, by supporting peace agreements. This is not to say that the GEF generally did this. This was in very specific contexts, like in Colombia, but it happened more than we expected. And finally, there's learning. And learning can happen from within the institution or outside. And we often saw learning happening during evaluations where there were problems or challenges that the project had faced. And the evaluation not only highlighted what the challenges were, but offered models from other projects and from other institutions. So our findings may be summarized with the following 3 observations. First, conflict and fragility matter. Second, these contexts present risks, but also opportunities. And third, projects in fragile and conflict-affected settings should be approached differently than non-conflict affected projects. This is conflict sensitivity. And that leads to specific recommendations. We had 5 key recommendations for the GEF. These recommendations were based on a combination of deductive reasoning, based on our findings and what logically could address that, based on suggestions from interviews, and based on experience from other institutions in addressing conflict sensitivity. So the first recommendation was that the GEF Secretariat should use the project review process to provide feedback to agencies to identify conflict and fragility related risks to a proposed project and to develop measures to mitigate those risks. The second recommendation was to improve conflict-sensitive programming while also providing flexibility. The GEF Secretariat could develop guidance for conflict-sensitive programming. Third, To improve conflict-sensitive design, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation, the GEF Secretariat, together with the agencies, should leverage existing platforms for learning, exchange, and technical assistance. I want to highlight this because there's so much that we are still learning, and to have an ongoing platform where projects can exchange, learn, share would be very useful. Third, the current GEF environmental social safeguards could be expanded to provide more details so that the GEF projects address key conflict-sensitive considerations. And you'll note here that this is could. The others were should, recognizing that safeguards can be a very politically sensitive process, and that they also do not tend to have the granular detail that projects often benefit from. And finally, the GEF Secretary could consider revising its policies and procedures so that GEF-supported projects can better adapt to rapid and substantial changes that are common in fragile and conflict-affected situations. When we submitted the evaluation, it was much longer than any of the other evaluations that the GEF Secretariat and subsequently Council were considering at that time. That said, both the findings and the recommendations were very well received. And I believe that one of the aspects that made this evaluation unusual and particularly well received was the combination of strong quantitative analysis and strong qualitative storytelling, that there were both the numbers to see the relevance and the narratives to see what could be done, and more specifically, how does this actually play out? Second, I also think that part of the reason this was so well received was that we weren't asking the GEF to do something that was outside their mandate. We weren't asking them to become a peace-building organization. What we were doing was highlighting certain risks that come up often, that are significant, that can be managed in pursuit of the specific global environmental benefits that is the GEF's mandate and expertise. So there is a need to build some expertise on conflict-sensitive programming, but it's in service of the primary and overarching objective of the GEF to advance global environmental benefits. There were a lot of interesting takeaways following on what I just said. First, the evaluators were careful not to evaluate impacts on peace, but rather to look at the set of factors that could affect performance. This is really because GEF is not a peace-building organization. So the evaluation was framed as a risk management exercise, trying to help the GEF achieve environmental objectives. It's also important that the focus of evaluation was on GEF projects, even while that analysis was placed in the broader literature and experiences of other institutions. Multi-level approach that we took of global, specific geographies and specific projects, combined with a mixed methods approach, provided a robust evaluation. Final report was lengthy due to different types of analyses that were done, but that additional weight and justification gave more credibility to the findings and to the recommendations. So yes, it was much longer, but it also was very robust. And that was important because this is on the periphery of where the GEF tends to operate. I think one of the most interesting things for me was that at the start of the project, we had ideas about what risks we would need to be alert to based on our knowledge of the field and the literature. However, after diving into the GEF experiences, we found a lot of nuance, and we found other ways of categorizing both the conflict-related risks and the approaches to conflict-sensitive programming. So those two figures that I showed, those really are based primarily on GEF experience. But as we looked at the broader literature, we saw that these typologies were consistent with what others had found. We also found that it was difficult to document examples of epic failures. Not just talking about the GEF, but just what happens when things go really wrong, when there isn't a consideration of the conflict context or fragility. And there were a couple of examples that we knew about because we had heard about them from colleagues, but they generally were not documented. And as a general matter, the failures, and particularly the epic failures, they can both be powerful learning opportunities, but they can be really hard to document. And I think that this is one of the ongoing challenges in conflict sensitivity is learning from the failures, whether it's failures of a particular institution or of others, that this often is not adequately documented. In closing, I'd like to highlight 3 key points. First, there is value in doing programmatic reviews, that often issues may come up on a project-by-project basis, sometimes more dramatic, sometimes less dramatic, but programmatic reviews allow the opportunity to see the effect of conflict and fragility across a spectrum of projects and contexts. Second, it's really important to consider how the evaluation is framed, especially if a conservation organization is trying to consider the role of conflict and fragility or conflict, fragility, peace in its programming, because that's not its mandate. And so thinking carefully about how will this be appropriate, how will it be received, how might it best inform future programming as a way of improving learning. In our case, it was by framing it as risk management. And third, there's a lot of value in focusing on experiences within a particular institution, that each institution has its own priorities, its own optics, it views other institutions differently. And if the evaluation is of other institutions or how others might do it, that may not have the same level of ownership. And so, yes, it is possible to learn from other institutions, but having the center of gravity be on experiences within that institution is one of the best ways to build buy-in for improving programming. With that, I thank you for your attention.